In the bustling industrial district of a mid-sized American city, James Anderson walked through the familiar doors of Sterling Manufacturing, just as he had done for the past 29 years. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the factory floor as he made his way to his office, greeting the maintenance crew with his usual warm smile. They called him Mr. Reliable behind his back, a nickname he'd earned through years of unwavering dedication. James's small office told the story of his career, walls decorated with safety awards, employee recognition certificates, and photos of company picnics from decades past. A particularly special frame held the newspaper clipping from 1994 when his quick thinking had prevented a major manufacturing defect, saving the company millions in potential recalls. His desk calendar had a date circled in red, just 3 months away, his planned retirement after 3 decades of service. As head of quality control, James had developed a reputation for catching problems before they became disasters. He created a filing system that other departments had adopted, and his training manual had become the gold standard across all of Sterling's facilities. The younger employees often joked that James could spot a defect from across the factory floor just by the sound of the machinery. Every morning, he'd walk the production line, checking in with his team, offering guidance where needed, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. The workers trusted him, not just because of his expertise, but because he treated everyone with respect, from the newest hire to the most seasoned veteran. He knew their names, their kids' names, and never forgot to ask about important events in their lives. James had started at Sterling right after college, working his way up from the production line. He still remembered his first day, nervous and eager, wanting to prove himself. Now, after nearly 3 decades, he'd become the backbone of the quality control department. His pension was almost secured, and he'd already started planning his retirement, fishing trips with his grandkids, finally taking that cross-country road trip with his wife, and maybe even writing down all the quality control wisdom he'd accumulated over the years. Life at Sterling had been good to James, despite its ups and downs. The company had supported him through tough times, like when his wife got sick 10 years ago, and they'd always recognized his contributions. That's why the recent changes felt so strange. The atmosphere had shifted since Michael Barrett took over as plant manager 6 months ago. The friendly morning greetings had become curt nods, and somehow James found himself left out of meetings he'd always been part of before. Still, James kept doing what he'd always done, putting his heart into his work, mentoring younger employees, and maintaining the high standards that had made Sterling's products trusted worldwide. He'd weathered company changes before, and with retirement so close, he focused on ensuring a smooth transition for whoever would take his place. That morning, as James settled into his daily routine, checking production reports and preparing for the morning meeting, he had no idea that his world was about to turn upside down. The next few hours would test everything he'd built over the past 29 years and challenge not just his career, but his dignity as a human being. The changes at Sterling Manufacturing didn't happen overnight. Like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, they came gradually after Michael Barrett's arrival as the new plant manager. At first, people tried to brush off the subtle shifts in the workplace atmosphere as typical adjustment pains under new leadership. But James Anderson, with his years of experience, sensed something wasn't quite right. It started with the morning meetings. James had always been a key voice in these discussions, his expertise crucial for maintaining product quality. But suddenly, he found himself receiving meeting notifications later and later, sometimes just minutes before they began. Once he arrived to find the conference room doors locked, the meeting already in progress. Through the glass, he could see Barrett leading the discussion, gesturing at presentation slides about quality control, James's department. The assignments changed too. Projects that would have naturally fallen under James's supervision began going to other managers, most with far less experience. When he offered input based on his decades of knowledge, Barrett would cut him off with a dismissive wave. "We're trying some new approaches," he'd say, not quite meeting James's eyes. "Fresh perspectives, you understand." During lunch breaks, James noticed how Barrett would joke and chat easily with certain employees, but whenever James approached, the plant manager would suddenly remember an urgent phone call or meeting. The pattern was clear, But James kept his observations to himself, focusing instead on maintaining the high standards he'd always upheld. One particularly telling incident occurred during the quarterly safety review. James had prepared a comprehensive report highlighting potential improvements backed by 30 years of data and experience. As he began his presentation, Barrett interrupted, "Let's keep this brief. I'm sure we all know the basic procedures by now." The room fell uncomfortably silent. Everyone knew James's safety protocols had prevented countless accidents over the years. The younger employees noticed the treatment too. Lisa from accounting would often stop by James' office, concerned about how Barrett seemed to ignore his input during meetings. "It's not right," she'd say. "You built half these systems yourself." But James would just smile and tell her to focus on her own work. Inside, though, each slight and dismissal stung. Barrett's behavior became more obvious at company events. During the summer picnic, he made a point of introducing visiting executives to every department head, except James. When questions about quality control came up, Barrett directed them to Tom, a junior manager who'd been with the company barely 2 years. James stood nearby, holding his paper plate, invisible. The conversations around the water cooler changed too. People spoke in whispers, glancing over their shoulders. Some of James's colleagues, people he'd worked with for decades, started finding excuses not to have lunch with him. Not everyone. There was still plenty who valued his friendship and expertise, but enough to notice. It was as if Barrett's attitude had created an invisible barrier around James. Despite it all, James maintained his professionalism. He continued documenting every quality issue, filing detailed reports, and supporting his team. When younger employees came to him for advice, he gave it freely, sharing the wisdom of his years without bitterness. His work ethic never wavered. He arrived early, stayed late when needed, and kept the quality control department running smoothly. But at home, sitting in his favorite chair after long days, James would sometimes let his guard down. His wife would find him staring at old company photos, lost in thought. "Maybe it's time to retire early," she'd suggest gently. But James would shake his head. He'd earned his full retirement package, and more importantly, he'd earned the right to leave on his own terms. Little did James know that Barrett's actions were building towards something bigger. The subtle slights and professional dismissals were just the beginning. A storm was brewing at Sterling Manufacturing, and soon it would break with a force that would shake the company to its foundations. The morning everything fell apart started like any other at Sterling Manufacturing. James arrived early, as usual, the ordinaire crisp against his face as he walked from the parking lot. He'd spent the weekend helping his grandson build a model airplane, and the memory of those tiny hands working with his brought a smile to his face as he unlocked his office. That smile faded when he saw the urgent emails flooding his inbox. There was an issue with the latest shipment of industrial parts, something about quality control failures. James's heart rate picked up as he read through the reports. This didn't make sense. He'd personally overseen the testing protocols for that batch just last week. Before he could dig deeper, Barrett burst into his office without knocking, his face flushed with what looked like rehearsed anger. "Conference room. Now." The plant manager's tone left no room for discussion. As James followed him down the hallway, he noticed several employees quickly averting their eyes. Something felt very wrong. In the conference room, James found himself facing not just Barrett, but also 2 members of HR he'd never seen before. His stomach dropped when he saw the papers spread across the table, quality control reports, but not the ones he'd filed. These looked different, altered somehow. "Would you care to explain this catastrophic failure in quality control?" Barrett's voice carried through the room like a thunderclap. He slapped a document onto the table. 300 defective parts shipped to our biggest client. 300. James reached for the report, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "There must be some mistake," he said, scanning the documents. "I personally checked this batch. Every single piece met our standards." But Barrett wasn't interested in explanations. He paced the room like a prosecutor delivering his closing argument. "Your negligence has cost this company millions," he declared. "The client is threatening to cancel all future contracts. This is exactly why we need fresh blood in quality control, not outdated methods from people who should have retired years ago." James tried to access his files on the computer to show his original reports, but his login had already been disabled. The sick feeling in his stomach grew as he realized this had been planned. He thought about all the recent events, the missed meetings, the sideline assignments, the subtle dismissals. They'd all been leading to this moment. "I have copies of the original reports," James said calmly, though his heart was racing, "and video footage from the testing lab. If you'll just give me a chance to." "We're done here," Barrett interrupted, sliding a document across the table. "This is your termination notice. Security will escort you to clear out your office." The HR representatives sat silently, avoiding eye contact. James noticed they had note files open, took no notes. This wasn't a proper termination meeting. It was theater, with him as the unwilling star. As security walked him to his office, James held his head high. Younger employees watched in shock as he packed his family photos and certificates into a cardboard box. 30 years of dedication, reduced to a few personal items he could carry out the door. Lisa from accounting tried to approach him, tears in her eyes, but a sharp look from Barrett stopped her in her tracks. The message was clear. Anyone who showed support for James might be next. In his office, James carefully packed away 3 decades of memories, the safety awards, the thank you notes from employees he'd mentored, the newspaper clipping about the recall he'd prevented. But most importantly, he slipped a small USB drive from his desk drawer into his pocket, one that contained copies of every report, every email, every piece of documentation he'd carefully preserved over the past 6 months. As he walked through the factory floor one last time, James noticed how the machines seemed to slow their rhythm, as if the building itself was protesting his departure. The morning shift workers, people he'd known for years, watched in stunned silence. Some nodded respectfully, their eyes conveying what they couldn't say aloud. In the parking lot, James placed his box in the trunk of his car and took one last look at the building where he'd spent most of his adult life. 3 months shy of retirement. 3 months short of his full pension. Barrett probably thought this was the end of the story. But as James drove away from Sterling Manufacturing for what he thought would be the last time, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he was going to do next. Because Barrett had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that after years of subtle discrimination and professional dismissals, James would simply walk away quietly. He hadn't counted on James's dignity, his integrity, or his foresight. And he certainly hadn't counted on that USB drive in James's pocket. The one that would soon turn this entire situation upside down. That evening, sitting at his kitchen table with his wife beside him, James opened his laptop and plugged in the USB drive that would change everything. His hands were steady as he clicked through folder after folder of meticulously organized evidence. While Barrett had been busy building his case to fire him, James had been quietly building something of his own, the truth. "You've been preparing for this," his wife said softly, watching as he opened documents dating back to Barrett's very first day. It wasn't just a collection of random files, it was a carefully crafted chronicle of 6 months of systematic discrimination. James nodded, pulling up his digital journal. "Remember all those late nights I spent organizing files?" He clicked through entry after entry, each one dated and time-stamped. Every inappropriate comment Barrett had made during meetings. Every time he'd been excluded from important decisions. Every instance where similar quality issues had been handled differently with other employees. But the real smoking gun was his documentation of the quality control process itself. James hadn't just kept copies of his reports. He'd taken photos of the testing equipment readings, saved the raw data files, and even recorded video clips of the actual testing process. All date-stamped, all properly logged, all showing conclusively that every single part in that defective batch had passed inspection with flying colors. After 30 years in quality control, James explained, pulling up another folder, "You learn to keep track of everything." This one contained emails from satisfied customers, including messages from the very client who had supposedly complained about the defective parts. In fact, they had praised the exceptional quality just days before his termination. His wife reached for his hand as he opened a spreadsheet tracking the pattern of assignments under Barrett's leadership. The numbers told a clear story. While other managers saw their responsibilities increase, James's role had been systematically diminished. Projects he'd successfully managed for years had been reassigned, often to less experienced employees. The next folder contained recordings of meetings, all legally obtained in a one-party consent state. In one clip, Barrett could be clearly heard dismissing James's safety protocols, the same protocols that had won the company numerous industry awards. In another, Barrett made thinly veiled remarks about old-school employees needing to move aside for the future. But perhaps most damning was the documentation about other quality control incidents. James had records of similar issues that had occurred over the past 6 months, instances where white employees had made genuine mistakes. In each case, they'd received additional training or minor warnings. None had been terminated, even though some incidents had been far more serious than the false allegations against him. "Look at this," James said, opening a series of photos. They showed the actual testing process for the supposedly defective batch, with clear timestamps and equipment readings. Barrett didn't just make a mistake, he manufactured this entire situation. The photos proved that the parts had not only met but exceeded quality standards. His wife squeezed his hand. "All those times you told me documentation was important, you were building a shield." James shook his head. "Not a shield," he corrected gently. "A sword." As they continued through the files, a fuller picture emerged. James hadn't just documented the discrimination, he'd created a paper trail that showed his own continued excellence despite it. Performance metrics, successful project completions, positive feedback from team members, cost-saving innovations he'd implemented. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of an exemplary employee being systematically pushed aside. The final folder contained something Barrett couldn't have anticipated: letters from current and former employees. Over the years, James had kept every thank you note, every email expressing gratitude for his mentorship, every message acknowledging how his guidance had helped someone's career. These weren't just documents, they were testimonials to his character and impact on the company. As midnight approached, James carefully backed up all the files to a secure cloud storage service. Tomorrow, he would take this evidence to an employment lawyer, but tonight, he felt a strange sense of peace. Barrett had thought he was ending a career, but he'd actually triggered something much bigger. "You know what the funny thing is?" James said, closing his laptop. "If Barrett had just treated me with basic respect, he never would have discovered how thoroughly I document everything." He smiled at his wife. Sometimes the best defense is being prepared for the worst, while always working for the best. The USB drive sat on the table between them, small but powerful. Inside it held not just evidence, but a testament to the importance of standing up for what's right. Barrett had underestimated James, assuming that age and race made him vulnerable. Instead, those 30 years of experience had taught James exactly how to protect himself, and now, that protection would become a catalyst for change. The law office of Chen and Associates occupied a modest suite in a downtown building. As James sat across from Attorney Chen, he watched her face change as she reviewed his evidence. She'd started the meeting with professional politeness, but as she clicked through file after file, her expression shifted to one of intense focus. "In 20 years of handling discrimination cases," she said, finally looking up from her laptop, "I've never seen documentation this thorough." She turned the screen to show a timeline she'd been creating. "You've given me everything I need to build an airtight case." James nodded, remembering all those extra hours spent organizing and backing up files. "I always told my team, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen." The next few days moved at lightning speed. Attorney Chen's team worked around the clock, transforming James's evidence into a powerful legal narrative. They filed not just a wrongful termination suit, but also complaints about systematic discrimination and retaliation. What happened next caught everyone by surprise. The story had barely hit Sterling Manufacturing's legal department when another email arrived, this one from a former employee at Barrett's previous company. Then another, and another. James's case had opened a floodgate of similar stories about Barrett's management history. Meanwhile, inside Sterling's corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. The head of human resources sat in an emergency meeting, face pale as she reviewed the evidence. "This isn't just a lawsuit," she told the executive team. "This is a potential PR nightmare." The company's internal investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Investigators interviewed current and former employees, reviewed security footage, and analyzed years of personnel records. Every rock they turned over seemed to reveal more evidence supporting James's case. Lisa from accounting finally felt safe enough to come forward. She described how Barrett had pressured her to alter quality control reports, threatening her job when she initially refused. Others began speaking up too. A chorus of voices confirming the pattern of discrimination James had documented. Back at home, James's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Former colleagues, industry contacts, even competitors reached out to offer support. His story had struck a chord, reminding everyone that workplace discrimination often hides behind seemingly professional facades. The corporate investigation team made a startling discovery in Barrett's company email. He'd actually written about his plan to force out older employees to modernize the department. The email chain showed he'd specifically targeted James, believing his age and race made him an easy target. Attorney Chen called James with updates almost daily. "The evidence keeps stacking up," she explained. "Barrett's previous employers are cooperating fully. They're afraid of being drawn into this." Some had settled similar complaints quietly, allowing Barrett to move on to other companies without consequences. One morning, exactly 10 days after filing the lawsuit, James received an unexpected call. Sterling Manufacturing CEO wanted to meet, not with his lawyers, but with him personally. The message was clear. They wanted to make this right. The corporate investigation had revealed something else. Barrett's claims about the defective parts were completely fabricated. The client had never complained. In fact, they'd recently submitted their largest order ever, specifically praising the quality control standards James had implemented. James sat in his living room that evening, reflecting on how quickly everything had changed. His wife brought him a cup of tea and sat beside him. "You're not just fighting for yourself anymore," she said softly. "You're fighting for everyone who's ever faced discrimination but didn't have the means to prove it." The next day's meeting would determine more than just James's future at Sterling Manufacturing. It would set a precedent for how companies handle discrimination cases. His meticulous documentation hadn't just protected his rights, it had created an opportunity for real change. Attorney Chen prepared him for the meeting with a simple piece of advice: let the evidence speak for itself. You've already won the moral victory. Now let's make sure this never happens to anyone else at Sterling Manufacturing. As James laid out his suit for the next day's meeting, he thought about all the young employees he'd mentored over the years. He'd always taught them about the importance of documentation, but now they were learning an even more valuable lesson about standing up for what's right, about preparing for the worst while working for the best, and about the power of truth in the face of injustice. The Sterling Manufacturing boardroom felt different from this side of the table. James sat beside Attorney Chen, facing not just the CEO, but the entire executive team. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline provided a dramatic backdrop to what would become a pivotal meeting in the company's history. First, the CEO began, his voice carrying the weight of serious consideration. "I want to apologize personally for what you've experienced, James." He wasn't reading from a prepared statement or glancing at legal notes. This was direct, human, and clearly genuine. "We've failed you, and in doing so, we've failed every employee who trusts us to maintain a fair workplace." The head of human resources spread out several documents on the polished conference table. "We've completed our internal investigation," she explained, her tone professional but tinged with clear disappointment in their oversight. "The evidence isn't just convincing, it's overwhelming." One by one, they laid out their findings. The quality control reports had indeed been tampered with, but not by James. Security footage showed Barrett accessing the testing lab after hours, the very night before James's termination. The client's actual feedback reports showed nothing but praise for the quality standards James had maintained. "What concerns us most," the CEO continued, "is how long this might have continued if you hadn't documented everything so carefully." He gestured to a thick folder, copies of James's evidence, now annotated with the company's own investigation findings. "You've exposed not just one instance of discrimination, but a systematic failure in our oversight." The news from Barrett's previous employers had hit hard. 3 separate companies had come forward, revealing similar incidents that had been quietly settled. Barrett had moved from job to job, his behavior unchecked, protected by confidentiality agreements and corporate fear of bad publicity. "We're not interested in protecting bad actors," the CEO stated firmly. "We're interested in protecting our employees and our company's values." He slid a document across the table, not a settlement offer bound by confidentiality, but a comprehensive plan for corporate change. The proposal outlined immediate actions. James would be reinstated with full back pay and benefits. His retirement timeline would be adjusted, allowing him to choose when to step down. But it went further than personal remedy. The company would implement new anti-discrimination training, establish an independent employee advocacy office, and create transparent reporting systems for workplace concerns. "We want to do more than just make this right for you," the HR director explained. "We want to make sure it never happens again." She described new oversight procedures, regular audits of management decisions, and clear promotion criteria that would prevent discriminatory practices. The most surprising part came next. They wanted James to help design and oversee these new systems. His experience, both as a long-time employee and as someone who had faced discrimination, made him uniquely qualified to identify blind spots in their policies. "Your documentation didn't just protect you," the CEO observed. "It showed us how to protect everyone." He gestured to the wall of windows, beyond which hundreds of employees went about their daily work. "They deserve better than what happened to you. Help us give it to them." The meeting shifted from corporate apology to active planning. James shared insights from his years of experience, not just about discrimination, but about building a workplace where everyone could thrive. His suggestions weren't met with defensive responses or bureaucratic obstacles. Instead, the executive team took notes, asked questions, and truly listened. As the meeting drew to a close, the CEO made one final announcement. Barrett had been placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his actions. The company would cooperate fully with any investigations by labor authorities, sharing their findings to prevent him from continuing this pattern at other companies. Back in his car afterward, James sat quietly for a moment, processing everything. Attorney Chen had called it a best-case outcome, but it felt like something more. This wasn't just about winning a case or getting his job back. It was about turning a painful experience into positive change. His phone buzzed with a message from Lisa in accounting. "Is it true? Are you coming back?" The news was already spreading through the company grapevine. He smiled, thinking about all the young employees who had watched him pack up his office just days ago. Now they would see something equally important. What happens when you stand up for what's right and have the evidence to back it up? The city skyline reflected in his rearview mirror as he drove home, looking different somehow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, implementing changes, rebuilding trust, creating systems to protect future employees. But for now, James felt the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice doesn't just prevail, it transforms. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sterling Manufacturing as James walked back into the building, this time with his head held high. Employees stopped what they were doing, and soon the sound of applause filled the factory floor. It wasn't just a return, it was a victory for everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment at work. Word had spread quickly about the changes coming to Sterling. The company hadn't tried to hide anything. Instead, they'd called an all-hands meeting to address the situation openly. The CEO stood before the entire workforce and acknowledged what had happened, using it as a teaching moment about accountability and corporate responsibility. Barrett's office was empty now. He'd been called to a meeting with the board of directors the previous day, where he faced the mountain of evidence against him. His attempt to defend his actions had crumbled in the face of James's meticulous documentation. The final blow came when other employees stepped forward, sharing their own experiences of discrimination under his leadership. "I never meant," Barrett had started to say, but the CEO cut him off. "Intent isn't enough," the CEO had stated firmly. "Your actions speak louder than any explanation." Now, 1 week later, the changes were already visible. The new employee advocacy office had opened, staffed by professionals trained in handling workplace discrimination cases. Posters announcing anonymous reporting channels and employee rights hung in break rooms and hallways. But more importantly, there was a shift in the atmosphere. People walked taller, spoke more freely, and worked with renewed confidence. Lisa from accounting stopped by James's office, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. "You know," she said, "when they'd forced you out, I was ready to quit. But watching you fight back, watching you win, it taught me something important about standing up for what's right." The quality control department hummed with activity. James's return brought back not just his expertise, but also his approach to leadership. Young employees gathered around as he explained testing procedures, his teaching style unchanged by recent events. If anything, he was more determined than ever to pass on everything he'd learned, including the importance of documenting everything. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Manufacturing became a case study in corporate transformation. Other companies reached out, wanting to learn from their experience. James found himself invited to speak at industry conferences, sharing his story and the lessons it taught about workplace discrimination and the power of documentation. The company's new policies became a model for others in the industry. The Independent Employee Advocacy Office handled concerns promptly and fairly. Regular audits of promotion practices and project assignments ensured equal opportunities for all employees. Training sessions on discrimination and harassment weren't just annual checkboxes anymore. They were meaningful discussions led by people who understood the real-world impact of these issues. Barrett's final attempt at redemption came in the form of a letter. "I've had time to reflect," he wrote. "I see now how my actions affected not just you, but everyone around me. The changes at Sterling, changes that happened because of your courage, have taught me hard but necessary lessons about leadership and human dignity." James pinned that letter to his office wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that change is possible when people are held accountable for their actions. Next to it hung a new company policy document, one he had helped write, outlining protections for employees facing discrimination. On his original retirement date, James surprised everyone by announcing he would stay on for another year. "There's still work to be done," he explained at the staff meeting. "And I want to make sure these changes last beyond my time here." The biggest change wasn't in the policies or procedures, it was in the people. Employees who had once stayed quiet about workplace issues now felt empowered to speak up. Managers who might have overlooked subtle discrimination became more attentive and proactive. The company culture shifted from one of silent endurance to active engagement in creating a fair workplace. A year later, when James finally did retire, the celebration filled the company cafeteria. Employees from every department came to share stories about his impact on their careers and lives. The CEO presented him with a special award, created in his honor, the Anderson Award for Workplace Integrity, to be given annually to employees who demonstrate exceptional courage in promoting workplace fairness. As James packed up his office for the last time, he found himself smiling at how different it felt from that dark day when he'd been unjustly fired. This time, he wasn't leaving with a box of memories, but with a legacy of change. His documentation hadn't just saved his career, it had transformed a company and inspired an industry. "Remember," he told the young quality control manager who would take his place, "every document tells a story. Make sure yours tells the truth." And so, James Anderson walked out of Sterling Manufacturing one final time, knowing that his greatest contribution wasn't in the quality control systems he'd built or the products he'd overseen. It was in showing that one person's stand for justice could create waves of positive change that would benefit generations to come.